Hi, Professor Bolt here with Chapter 9 of our Tactical Storytelling in Business from our TWIST book. There's a lot of things about business communications, whole courses on it. We're going to cover some of the standard basics, but we're also going to get into a little bit of the storytelling and tactical techniques we want to be able to use. So Steve Jobs from Apple, very well-known, very successful business person. This is one of my favorite quotes from him. The most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. Storyteller sets the vision, the values, the agenda of an entire generation that is to come. And part of Steve's role at Apple was as a visionary storyteller. He could tell stories to the people within the company, he could tell stories outside the company, and that's part of what made him so successful as he led Apple to being a trillion-dollar company. So, quick overview of what we're going to cover in today's lecture, sort of the importance of effective communication business. Communication is a key skill in business, both inside the company and out. We'll talk about some of the very standard things, the roles and structures of memos and emails and business communication. These are actually places where you don't get quite as much opportunity for storytelling, although there can be lots of technical techniques you have to employ, just not quite as much storytelling. And then we'll get into the significance of oral communication storytelling. We'll actually just go ahead and start with that for a number of the examples. There's a lot more storytelling in the oral side because you have to you have to have a lot more improvisation when you're dealing with oral communication. You have to match the stories to the settings in the audience, and that means you have to end up doing a little bit more storytelling. You can't have just data. And also because your interactions are far more tactical, you're going to want to make sure those stories are tied to what you're trying to achieve in the oral communication. So when we're going to look at some of the techniques for crafting from a structural point of view, the structure of your document, the opening and closing lines, and that will help us make some of our business storytelling actionable. We'll give some practical examples of business storytelling and how to transition that advice into practical storytelling for your business side. Getting deeper into the structural sides, there's a variety of storytelling structures that are used in business. Classic things like the hero's journey and chronological structure, the structure we're talking. But there's some very well-known patterns that are used more dominantly within business. And so we're talking about leveraging those well-known patterns for a way of engaging your audience, because when your audience is expecting certain things, it helps to use a structure that's set up for that. And how that can help make your storytelling more effective, and how we can adapt those same structures to different contexts. When we get to these examples, we'll go through one or two where we talk about adapting it. One of the things that's important, all writing, of course, is understanding your audience. In business, you have to spend a little bit more time understanding your audience before you begin communicating. The different audiences can have very different communication styles, and you have to understand as well the power dynamics in business storytelling. In many writing efforts, you're writing to an audience you don't interact with. Oral storytelling in general requires you to interact a lot more. But one of the things that happens in business is you have this sort of power dynamics over time. You're interacting with the same people over and over and over again, and therefore you have to work with them. But you still want to talk about how you're going to tailor your stories to different audience segments and how that role of audience is effective in storytelling. We'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to go through three main business applications, maybe a fourth when I start, but we'll start with oral. But the applications we'll get into are emails, memos, and marketing. We'll talk a little bit about the role of storytelling and when not to be telling stories in emails and memos. And so there's some tactical writing that goes into them that's often not as much storytelling, but what is my objectives? What's the analysis? So many of the things we have in the TWIST paradigm show up. They just may not be as much storytelling. We'll talk a little bit about some of the do's and don'ts of business writing, some problems you can run into. And then we'll talk, again, a micro case study, marketing, storytelling, and it's micro because you can have whole courses in marketing. There are multiple, and so you have to be very careful. We're not going to tell you how to do marketing. We'll just give some little case studies about how marketing works. And when to use storytelling in business really comes down to you understanding your audience and understanding what's going on. One of the other key aspects of communication in business with respect to tactical writing is understanding language and tone in business communications. You've got to choose the right words for the impact, and the importance of that language and tone on your audience can be very important. In the example image here, right? Though that's not me, when you're talking about military oriented technologies or businesses to a group of people, you would actually end up often using a very different language than if you were talking to, say, a church group, or if you were talking to a energy production group. So you have to adapt your language to different business scenarios, even if your company does exactly the same thing. It'll affect the tone of the message, the word choices you're going to go through. So we'll talk a little bit about crafting your messages for maximum effectiveness in different audiences. One of the key places, which hopefully one day you'll get a chance, is when you're the leaders for an organization, that storytelling is a very powerful tool for leaders. It's sort of getting the objectives and the goal of business set together, crafting stories for deep audience connections, and impacting storytelling on opinions and motivations, and using that story to illuminate paths for change. So recently I was at one of the companies I'm an advisor with, and the CEO of the company was telling stories about what the company's been doing over the last couple of years, sort of giving everyone, investors, stakeholders, employees, sort of an update of where they are and where they're going. And he did a really good job of using the stories of some of the early aspects of their company and product and some of the struggles they ran into, how the team of motivated people within the organization was good at putting those together and moving things forward. Gave examples of how they were able to deal with one of their products it's for the military. They were out on a mission for testing, and the drone that it was attached to crashed and was destroyed. Multi-million-dollar drone destroyed. Their technology, however, survived the crash, was reusable, showing not just how well the product worked to work on its original objective, but how that was able to show how robust it was, and how he then used that in follow-on briefings within the military to show that the company is really not just about delivering value in the simplest form, but a long-term value for the things, right? So being able for him to tell those stories was just reminding me so much of what I'm trying to talk about here, which is leaders have stories for different groups in different ways. He was at the same time talking to his investors, to his advisors, and to his employees, and was able to integrate them into a good, coherent story that showed lots of value for everyone. So when we talk about some of the storytelling, so here are what I would consider my top 10 applications of internal business storytelling. And there's some more examples in the chapter, getting into different ones of these. But using storytelling to motivate teams, to help navigate change. Companies, when they go through change, stories are an important part of both why things are changing and how they're changing and what the future looks like. They're critical for fostering company culture. The way you tell a story, but the content of the story is also part of your culture. They have great value for onboarding and training. So when I'm trying to onboard new employees and train them into the company, it's related to the culture, but it also has stories, teaching stories. We'll get into some examples. We'll talk about different types, and teaching is one of those story types. It's useful from a managerial point of view for resolving conflicts and trying to avoid conflicts before things get too bad. At the same time, you can use it to celebrate success. The example I just gave, he was celebrating his successes this year. The CEO was, complimenting the employees. Actually, I gave them a chance to stand up and say a little about what they've done, making everyone feel part of the connection. It can also be really important for building leadership skills. As you have middle level employees that you want to move up, getting them to build their storytelling technique is a great way to help them build their leadership skills as they have to manage conflict and teams and whatever. It's great for overall enhancing communication within the company. As you tell stories, you embody the employees within your company to have stories to tell, because now they understand what stories worked and what they've heard, and that allows them to enhance their own communication, sort of for word of mouth communication about the company. It's great for innovation and problem solving. Stories are a way of putting things in context, of making things clear what is the problem as you refine it and work towards that, and helping to make a great collaborative environment. There's a bunch of other places where we use business storytelling. It's on the sort of on the outside. So my top 10 applications for external business storytelling. Influencing decision makers. So having the advisors at the company's meeting, we're not quite decision makers, but we're influencers, right? And he wants to influence have us help influence the funders, the investors who actually were at the meeting, and they are decision makers. It can be very important for developing a business's image. What is the company about? Where are they going? Creating a memorable brand. This is part of marketing and branding, right? You can both make it memorable and also help humanize that brand so that you seem more relatable. And brand advocacy, making sure people understand what is your brand about, differentiating it from others, right? And branding is not all the same as marketing. It's related, but it's different. But you can then turn it around and actually use it as effective stories as part of your effective sales strategy, both as the marketing message to get leads, but then once you're in a sales meeting to actually help close and move sales forward. Once you have done sales, it's often a great part of fostering customer loyalty, customer engagement. You can even get customer engagement via content creation where you're just keeping your customers engaged with you by telling stories, having a blog, things like that, where you go out and keep that content going. And with today's world of social media marketing, that can actually significantly enhance your marketing strategies as your stories get told and retold and shared. If you can get one to go viral, then you're really doing well at getting your marketing message out there at a lower cost. So I'm going to go through a couple examples where we're going to talk about some of these top 10, not all of them, there's too many, but I'll hit a couple, and we'll talk about how they can be useful and the things that go into them. So a classic case where I would use them all the time, many companies use them all the time, is for hiring and recruiting. One of the things your company has to do if it's going to grow and be successful is attract top talent. So storytelling is part of how you tell them, those people, often very quickly, what it is you're about. You want to showcase your company's missions, your value, what it is you're trying to do. You can often be telling stories of employee growth and development, depending on both who you're looking to hire and what the roles are. So example stories would be like the company's beginnings, employee success stories, things that you feel for the particular talent you're trying to recruit would be important. Classic techniques here are the hero's journey, where somebody has grown up and become very successful. Anecdotes of commitment or inclusivity, depending on what it is you're trying to hire in your story. So there's lots of very classic storytelling that goes here. And because hiring is a personal decision for somebody to join your company, making that personal connection becomes important. And so personal stories, which is what stories are really good at, becomes a very great place to be able to use this. Sorry, I got the slide out of order. So oral storytelling is a key tool. It's hiring, culture, sales, teamwork. I'm going to go through these examples. You're going to combine context examples and storytelling techniques and use that to bridge, inspire action, create lasting impact, and to execute on a business communication. So you want to have this strategic view of what it is you're trying to do. So going back right now, I should do the hiring and recruiting, right? This is one of your key goals. You have to make sure you get this in there. This is one of the places where you would definitely be using storytelling. Another one example in the top 10 is company culture. Company culture, you now have your employees. You want to define and maintain organizational values. You can use stories to exemplify ethics and principles about your company. You can tell stories during onboarding, or you can tell stories at regular company meetings. Part of this is to have techniques. Part of the techniques you would be using here are stories that include metaphors, analogies, challenge success narratives where you had a challenge and your group overcame it. This is great for building companies' cultures, feeling of success and their ability to accomplish things. And you want to use stories that align with company culture, and sometimes you will also be using to set the vision for the future company culture, putting those together. A consistent narrative for company culture is very important, and so this is where some of the metaphors and analogies allow you to have things where you have the consistent metaphor, this is an analogy showing up and being used, but you can change it up. So if you use this every monthly meeting, right, you want to have the company culture stuff moving forward, but you don't want it to become monotonous. You don't want the same mission statement restated. You want to have an analogy or metaphor that you can reuse over and over. Okay, and when you're looking at it from a sales point of view, storytelling is a great way of transforming customers' perceptions of products and services. They can highlight customer success and product evolution. These are different types of stories, and they depend on what it is you're trying to show. But again, what's in it for them is important for storytelling. It's super important in sales. And so instead of telling a story just about you can tell stories about the client's success. Clients who use your product to become successful are more likely to engage a potential buyer than a story about how your company is so great, right? Some clients, some customers will look for companies that are successful and that's part of what they're looking for. So this is one of the places where you have to be able to read the audience, understand what's motivating them, and then turn it around. So problem solution structures are very effective for telling clients overcoming a problem using your technique. Sometimes you can make an emotional connection about somebody who's benefited from your product. And there are definitely times when you have vivid success portrayals of your company's success, or the client's success is an even better way of telling those stories. One thing to be careful about when you're telling customer stories is you should either have the customer's who's in the story's permission to use it, or use a story where you never identify the customer. You can't be talking about having certain customers, because if it gets back to them and they weren't comfortable with that's bad. And sometimes customer success stories are about a difficulty they had to overcome, and some companies don't want you talking about the difficulties they had. So check with them before you go to talk about them in a sales. In my own companies, most of the customers I wanted to be able to talk about were happy to have us talk about them. But we had some where the customer said, this is the exact phrase you can use to describe our work together. And especially in security areas, and my companies were all security oriented, some of them are very cautious because they're not sure they want people to know what they want, what they're doing. Within your company for teamwork, which is a little bit related to culture, but this is more, I think, stories for smaller meetings. And I'll get to some examples when we get to different types of stories of places this can be very effective. So for teamwork, you want to sort of enhance the sense of belonging and shared purpose among your team and as you're moving towards goals. So you can use stories to unite individuals, communicate objectives, inspire collaboration. As you've been working in teams in your writing in this class, hopefully, you've actually shared some of these stories. So some examples of this are collected effort and success stories and meetings where people have gotten together. You talk about how they've been successful. You can have techniques that involve shared mission emphasis, personal narratives, and I'll go through some examples of that a little bit farther. But these are things where you often want to value individual contributions. So the stories are often about a person helping the team and the teamwork. There can be here stories in the team when you're trying to motivate them about customers. So they're not all internal stories, but stories about the person help humanize them and make the team members have better connections between each other. So that's another place where you would want to have some level of storytelling about the people and how they relate to the team. Related but different is management stories. So when you're in a management position, you're often trying to deal with some things. And these are then stories we want to use to motivate, guide, and at times exemplify leadership. I'm a big fan of stories that connect with the team on a human level through personal stories. Many leaders in management want to have stories that never show weakness. I'm a much more human level. I want to connect with them at that level. Although for some reason people view me as sort of intimidating, I try not to be, and maybe that's why I have to work harder to connect to the personal level. But I've worked in companies where the managers exemplified leadership and they wanted to show confidence, knowledge, skills. They wanted to show no weaknesses. Those are other kinds of stories. Both of those can work depending on the style of management you're looking at. So they're not all connecting on a human level, but those are the ones that I tend to connect with the most. They can have leadership lessons from past experiences. Again, this is a place where you want to be careful to not use actual names of people because if they get back to them, it can be misinterpreted. If you made somebody look bad, that as part of your leadership lesson, it should be a hypothetical person. At least the way everyone views it from. I actually believe in using past stories, just changing the names to protect the innocent or the guilty, depending on what they are. So you want to find ones that align with your leadership principle and leadership styles. You still want relatable anecdotes that people can remember. Again, going back, right, there might be some themes and metaphors that show up here that you use over and over again as part of the way you do things. In general, as management, one of the things you want to do is you want to emphasize personal growth, but you also want to make that fit within your managerial style. So if you're the one who's deciding what people do and you're giving out assignments, that's part of your style. You can talk about how people grow within that. If you're the kind of person that wants to and have your employees volunteer to do stuff and then do it, you can talk about how that leads to the growth. So you can tell lots of different styles of stories. So there's just a couple examples of things that I have found very storytelling, oral storytelling. And in fact, in every one of the cases I just went through, it's all oral storytelling. That are so useful. You have to be able to read the audience. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but you have to be able to put it in context. And there's not one story that fits all cities, so you have to put them together. So when we go to look at the sort of business stories, we've already mentioned the hero's journey and sort of chronological history of the company. Those kinds of things are classic storytelling. But there's a couple of structural styles that I find used in business that are not quite so common in traditional storytelling, and you'll see as I go through the examples why they're useful. These structures align very well with the tactical objectives that you're trying to achieve in business. And all the ones I'm going to go through, although I've used a number of these in my own settings for different reasons, I'm going to actually follow Annette Simons in her very good book, Whoever tells the best stories win. It's a great business storybook. She identifies 6 powerful structural styles for crafting business stories that we're going to explore in some level of detail. And I'm going through all of these, and I'm using her terms. I've used them, and I would have called them something different. But since they're tied to that book, I really like the way these work out. And I've used every one of these techniques in my businesses. So the first of these is who I am stories. It's pretty easy to remember. It's the first person, who I am. These stories reveal personal identity, experiences. They encompass dreams, goals, accomplishment, failures, motivations, histories. They're essential for building trust, especially when introducing oneself to a new team or establishing connections. So I've used this in my own companies, trying to humanize and relate to people, establishing common ground and build trust. In my companies, I'm not focused on money. I'm focused on a little bit about my background, where I started from, helps people relate to me. But more importantly, I've actually used this whenever I bring in a new team member. And I tell a story in the book of Chris, who was a team member in my company. When he was first brought in, he was coming in and was going to be above some people who have been in the company a little bit longer. And so there's always a sort of weird dynamic that happens with that. So I wanted him to tell his story. So the who I am in this case became Chris telling who he is. But by telling the stories, showing his skills and experience, but not really, sort of trying to puff himself up, but both the struggles and where he got, it established a common ground and built a trust among the employees so they could see why he was brought in. He had a set of skills that they didn't really have, even though they were more experienced in some dimensions. The project he was going to be leading as a team member, he had some experiences, but it also built trust and relationships between them. This is one of the reasons why in many business settings, one of the first things you do in new team meetings is you all introduce yourself and tell some things. And we often see in that setting where we want to say, 1 or 2 things that are from outside of just what this meeting is about. Things that talk about your history, your motivation, your personal interests, because you can begin to connect with people on a personal level, and that can be very valuable. So the second, very related, which is a little bit about who I am, but why am I here stories. And I tell these stories all the time. When I talk about the BI, the innovation program at UCCS, I tell a story about who I am, how I struggle in my companies, and why I'm here to do this degree, because it gives people a reason to understand why I would be doing this, right? I'm very successful as a researcher and a business person in my own right, why I'm at this university doing it. Once I tell that story, it really helps clarify my intentions and what's going on. It often addresses unspoken questions. People will often wonder, why, if I can do those things, why am I not making money? It's like, well, money's not what motivates me, right? I got to say why I'm here. What are my personal stories? What's motivated me? And that can help promote transparencies and make people connect. The same was true in my company. I didn't focus on making money. I focused on making a difference. And that was important both when I'm trying to hire new people. These are the kinds of stories when I am looking to hire people. I will often tell these stories and then ask them questions and see if that's what they're related to. And this then transitions to really the next kind of story, which is vision stories. Vision stories are really inspirational narratives that lead actions to valuable, notable outcomes. So again, when I talk about the Bachelor of Innovation and the innovation degree stuff, I have both my personal reasons why I'm here, but a vision of the future, how this is going to transform things for the people engaged, for the businesses that hired these people, for the people themselves, though it might take them a while to see the value they're getting. I want to tell those vision stories. I want to inspire students and motivate them to grow within the program. I want to inspire students to join the program. I want to inspire companies to work with us. And so those kinds of vision stories are very important. Vision stories are one of the things that Steve Jobs was a master at, both internally and externally. This was part of how he got people motivated. And when he told stories back in the earliest days of Apple, when he talked about how the personal computer and the Apple IIe would transform education, he actually was very passionate and told these visionary stories of how it would change the classroom, and it did, right? And so it helps that he was able to deliver on those stories. But that ability to connect efforts to outcomes provides direction and purpose and gets people excited. Vision stories are some of the most powerful stories. And while the who I am and why am I here stories are things you can practice a little bit, vision stories are one of the few stories where I think you really want to sit down and actually think of them as a speech. You want to really spend time thinking about the right metaphors, how do I connect to them? because they're bigger stories. They're long-term things. Who I am and why am I here are things you want to have as a conversation. Vision stories are more of a talk, less of a conversation. Related to vision, because visions also often include values, are value and action stories. And these are things, again, within a company, sometimes externally facing, that are talking about your company. So when you talk about company culture, stories, these are the kinds of stories that often show up when we're trying to maintain or build company culture. Value and action stories are in my view, often an allegory where you're telling something that's not exactly what you're saying. Because to say, I'm virtuous just sounds boastful and on-off and doesn't come across right. So what you want is a story where the listener can hear and see and think about the virtues or values, right? Or caution, the things you're cautioned against. You can tell both positive and negative value and action stories. And the goal is to promote virtues, provide guidance, and discourage negative behavior. So you might tell cautionary tales about behavior that went awry, and how something had to go, when it went wrong. You can talk about things that were very positive. Value and action stories are often also a place where a company gets to talk about some of the non-straightforward business things. So when your company does community service, that's a kind of values and action stories. And in fact, it's more in the action and a very short little story because it's the action that really wants to matter, because very often actions speak louder than words. But it helps when you go to tell the story that there were actions out there. So values and actions are often about doing good and a short story about it or a mention of it. Value and action stories, in fact, in my view, are also very often better told when you're telling a value and action story about someone else. If it's about you, it's somewhat self-serving. It doesn't quite work the same. So it's better if you can get value and action stories and tell them about your employees. If you talk about how your employees embody your values and they're out serving the community or working at a cancer walk, or they're out in the community helping to feed the homeless, or they're out in the community helping to serve veterans, right? Those are all great things your company's doing. You're talking about them, you're building them up, and at the same time, it's talking about how you're promoting the virtues that you believe are important and your company values. So it's a double win. Talking about what you did personally, probably not the best way of approaching that because that comes across often negatively, with one major exception. Discouraging negative behaviors, if you want to talk about how you messed up and how you learned from that, that can actually still be a very valuable values and action stories at a personal level. As long as you're not trying to make yourself look too good, you're talking about your self-deprivation, that's okay. I will say even that, and I've been in situations where people feel the person was putting themselves down so much to make themselves look better, sort of a false humility. So you got to keep your value and action stories balanced and think about how will they land on other people, not just how do they sound to you. How they sound to other people is actually a really important part of the next kind of story, which I find is very common within business in a more subtle way. So you can actually work this into some of the other things, like the why am I here stories are often a little bit of I know what you're thinking stories. But these are stories where you explicitly or implicitly try and address the anticipated audience objections, suspicions, concerns, where you show some level of understanding and empathy. So going back again to some of the Bachelor of Innovation stories, when I was trying to talk to faculty about this and convince them this was a good idea, I told this kind of story all the time related to why am I here. But I have to anticipate that they think, oh, students won't be able to do this. They think this is a skill we won't have, that this won't be valued by companies. You anticipate those. And again, audience analysis. This is where your audience analysis really shows up. You've got to think about who they are, what's motivating, what concerns will they have. Put that together. When you present it, you have to demonstrate empathy. You got to build trust and rapport by having both data that says why this can be overcome, and at the same time talking about empathy. That faculty, for example, in the innovation case, that they might not feel comfortable teaching these classes, but that's why we're going to bring in other people to teach these classes. We're not asking you to change. We understand you're good at what you do. You want to tell those stories. You want to build trust and rapport that the audience gets there. And this kind of story is so powerful in business because if you guessed right and if you address that concern, now you can move somebody from being a no to a yes. And getting into yes is often a big part of business negotiations and communication. If you guess what the no is and you adequately address it, then they move from no to yes, and that's great. You sometimes do this very explicitly and you can actually say, you might be thinking this. Other times you bring it up and you talk about some third party. Some people might think this, not saying them. There's a real advantage when you're doing the I know what you're thinking stories and you don't say I know what you are thinking. I know what some people might be thinking, because then you have the advantage that if they don't think this, then you don't come across as egotistical enough to say, well, I know what you're thinking, right? No, I'm not saying it's you. Some people are thinking this. If they are, then you've covered. And if not, then you're not saying you understand them better. This is particularly useful when you're telling I know what you're thinking stories with people within the company where you have lots of personal interactions. When you're management, you are often not viewed by the people underneath you as connecting with them. So when you try and relate to them by saying, I know what you're thinking, you come across as aloof, and it's very negative. So I recommend when you're dealing with people within your organization, never use I know what you are thinking. Some people are. We've had a recent president who often says some people are, this was their way of saying what they think people are saying without saying exactly who it is. And that can be very effective, even when you're talking external business stuff. The last kind of classic story, which is a story, again, outside of business, but very common within business, more so from an internal point of view, although it can have some external value, are what are called teaching stories. These are stories where your goal is to create transformative experiences, demonstrating change in behavior, perspective, or skills leading to meaningful results. So obviously when I'm doing employee training, I'm doing teaching stories. But I can do teaching stories. The lecture here is a kind of story, but most of my lectures are not as story-oriented as they are content-oriented. Teaching stories, I've worked a few in today, are when I talk about my personal experiences, and I use them as a way about teaching what can go wrong. Teaching stories can facilitate learning. Again, they can become far more memorable. You can use them as a way of presenting stories and encouraging learning through experience or through somebody else's experience so that you don't have to go through it. So these are the Simon 6. These are great types of stories. They're not individualized. They can be mixed together. So I can have a why am I here, I know what you're thinking teaching story all combined into one thing with elements of all three of those trying to go together. Or you can have one that's really just a single type of story. Now, there's a bunch of other storytelling structures, and I'm going to mention these because you'll see them when other people talk about business stories. So I'm going to hit like one or two sentences about these. So people will often talk about business story structures, and they'll talk about the origin stories. Origin stories are how did a company begin? Origin stories are often a little bit about who am I or why am I here, but they can also be just chronological. Here's what the facts in the company growth. I prefer the ones that have more personal touch, a little bit more reasoning behind them, but origin stories can be either. Failure stories can be a subset, again, of many of the Simon 6, but failure stories are often meant as a teaching lesson. Here's what went wrong, and here's how we recovered. And that can show off some values. In fact, so failure stories are sometimes followed by success, failure to success, the hero overcoming the obstacles. Failure, again, the classic part, danger and struggle are a common part of what we need in any good story. And so that's a part. Success then showing the sort of things at the end. Customer stories are actually already mentioned, are quite common as a way of relating. Product stories are a particular thing, a story about a product which can relate to the customer and how the product was used. And they have a far greater focus on the product itself. And then there's personal stories, again, things about the person who's talking or employees in your company. So there are a subclass of stories. But all these are types of stories you'll have mentioned, so I thought it's worth mentioning them. The last one you might not have heard of, but it is actually a growing trend. It comes out of Clay Christensen's work, sort of the job to be done stories. And I like to think of these, and I find them useful. My companies, I didn't learn about these until after I was done my last company. Jobs to be done are really about the problem to be solved. But instead of I should have had the word problem stories on here because people talk about problem stories all the time. Problem stories are here's the problem, here's how our product helps you overcome it, or here's the problem when you're trying to motivate people within a company and you don't have a solution, here's the problem. I like the jobs to be done terminology because it's really about not the problem, but what you need that really helps this problem solve. And Clay Christensen tells some great jobs to be done stories. He did some work with fast food restaurants trying to understand how they could improve the sales of their shakes. And they studied like when were shakes sold, and they were surprised to find a lot of shakes sold first thing in the morning. And that confused them for a little while because it's people think, oh, it's hot, I want. It's like, no, what was the job to be done for the shake in that story? The job to be done story for the shake was I wanted the person who bought it wanted something that they could sip while driving instead of hot coffee, or maybe in addition to hot coffee, but they wanted something they could slowly consume while they were driving. And this led to actually improvement in the product by making it even thicker so that it lasted longer and didn't melt as fast. So jobs to be done stories can be very useful. It's a way of looking at the problem to be solved, but going a little deeper. So this is the first half hour. We're going to head and stop the video here. Come back for part two. Well, we'll get into more content.